Right, thanks very much. So Paul begins his book by saying, arguably Wittgenstein's singular achievement was to have appreciated the true nature of philosophy. And if you're wondering what the true nature of philosophy is, turns out, according to Paul's Wittgenstein, in the short version, that it's rubbish. So the primary aim of Paul's book is to expound and support a certain conception of philosophy. It's a conception that he takes to be Wittgenstein's, but arguing that it was Wittgenstein's is a really very secondary aim of the book, although I think Paul thinks that if you look at part one of Philosophical Investigations, you can see that Wittgenstein does intend something along these lines. And I'm going to follow Paul in being concerned with this conception of philosophy as on its own merits or lack thereof, rather than being concerned with questions of whether this is what Wittgenstein meant, which I'm happy to leave to Wittgenstein scholars. So if you read the book, you get exposed to just two sorts of philosophy. These are really the only two sorts that get probably mentioned in the book. There's what Paul calls T philosophy, where the T stands for both traditional and theoretical. And the other sort is the Wittgensteinian therapeutic critique of T philosophy. One interesting feature of the therapeutic critique on Paul's view is that it does not rest on any particular view about meaning. The way it proceeds is rather by detailed case studies of samples of T philosophy. And those case studies are intended to show up its ill-founded scientific pretensions, its cavalier way with recalcitrant data, its blindness to simple resolutions of supposedly deep problems, and the irrational dogmatism of its practitioners. Irrational is one of Paul's favorite words for describing T philosophers. So the picture that emerges is one on which 90% of philosophy is just a waste of space, it's bad T philosophy, while the remaining 10% consists of praiseworthy Wittgensteinian demolitions of the first 90%. Now, one thing that Paul doesn't explain is why, if that's what philosophy is like, it shouldn't simply be abolished. As it were, if we've got a discipline which consists of 90% making a mess and 10% clearing up the mess, I mean, wouldn't it be better just not to make the mess in the first place? And so, it's a sort of puzzle, if on this view, why we should expect taxpayers to fund a branch of the academy that has this sort of structure. Now, there is a line that you quite often find in proponents of a therapeutic conception of philosophy, which is that actually philosophy shouldn't be abolished because it performs valuable purgative services for the wider culture. That's where it's not just philosophy where you get these forms of rubbish that need to be tidied up. They're being generated even outside philosophy, and so we need garbage collectors, even if we don't have people who are paid to produce garbage. But interestingly, Paul doesn't make that argument in the book. Of course, there's a danger if you overdo that argument that you end up making somewhat implausible claims about the incoherence of large swathes of other academic disciplines. For example, cognitive science has been one target of some kinds of therapeutic critique outside philosophy itself. Now, of course, the conclusion that Horwich and Wittgenstein draw is not that we should be doing tea philosophy better, but that we shouldn't be doing it at all. So the upshot of the critique is supposed to be that tea philosophy is a hopeless enterprise. I mean, it's a construction of elaborate theories to solve what are in fact pseudo-problems. Now, I mean, that sort of conception that there really is no room for tea philosophy looks like the sort of surprising, very general conclusion that is typical of tea philosophy itself. Right? I mean, after all, there's a long tradition. Think of Locke's essay or Kant's critique of pure reason, which philosophy is concerned to, I mean, tea philosophy is concerned to draw limits to what cognitive enterprises are possible for humans. And one might think that, in effect, that the conclusion about the true nature of philosophy is just such a limitative conclusion characteristic of one style of tea philosophy. And so, of course, this raises the notorious difficulty that there seems to be something self-refuting about Wittgenstein's metaphilosophy. Now, I mean, often that charge is met in somewhat evasive ways, but I think to Paul's credit, he confronts the difficulty head on. So his response is that critique of philosophy does not involve a theory about some kind of hidden reality. It's just drawing attention to very straightforward matters which are open to view on the surface. And once your attention has been drawn to them, then the conclusion that tea philosophy is irrational is just a statement of the obvious. Now, I mean, you might wonder how it could be a statement of the obvious given that so many tea philosophers deny it, but one point on which I agree with Paul is that the mere fact that a lot of people deny something does not entail that it's not obvious. So we haven't, as well, we can't quite dismiss the idea that these things are obvious just on those grounds. But it's obviously somewhat problematic that a lot of tea philosophers themselves claim that their conclusions are potentially obvious once your attention has been drawn to the relevant, straightforward matters. It's not as it were only the Wittgensteinian therapist who has proprietary rights on the obvious. And so the natural question is whether the kind of considerations that Paul is giving in the book, or that perhaps Wittgenstein himself is giving, are somehow clearer or more decisive or more obvious than one finds in tea philosophy. And it seems to me, pretty plain that they're not. I mean, it's actually part of what Paul intends explicitly to do in the book, is to render Wittgensteinian considerations in terms of arguments of a recognizably philosophical kind, to, as he says, to write in the style of contemporary analytic philosophy, to, as it were, the charge of is often made against various forms of Wittgensteinian discourse. But I mean that certainly facilitates the assessment of his arguments, and I mean they're better than many you find in tea philosophy, and worse than many others. I mean they're just, as it were, business as usual as far as tea philosophy goes, and in fact, I mean his arguments in many cases suffer from exactly the sorts of faults which he regards as characteristic of tea philosophy. So, I mean, I don't want to labour this, but I'll just mention a couple of examples. So, one is where he's doing a case study of contemporary philosophers of mind who are trying to engage with what they regard as the mystery of consciousness, and so Paul is attempting some kind of dissolution of that. I mean, it's not that I'm a great lover of the consciousness literature, but let's see how Paul attempts this dissolution. So he following Wittgenstein, he focuses on the use of the word pain as the sort of example that these contemporary philosophers of consciousness are interested in. And I mean, he gives a description of the way in which the word pain is used. And I'll just mention a few aspects of it. One is that following Wittgenstein, he claims that the sentence, he thinks he is in pain, but perhaps he is mistaken. And the sentence, I'm not sure if I'm in pain, he says, are considered deviant anomalous, a sort of violation of linguistic rules. It's a quotation. Now, it seems to me if you pause for a moment, you see that is just not the case. So, for example, with the sentence, I'm not sure if I'm in pain. I mean, sometimes my son, for example, pinches me. And it's kind of irritating, but it's not clear to me whether the irritation is bad enough to be pain. That's a case where, without any kind of theory going on, it seems completely appropriate to use the sentence, I'm not sure if I'm in pain. Or if we take the other example, he thinks he's in pain, but perhaps he's mistaken. Suppose we know someone who's terribly prone to self-pity, and we see him bump into let's say bump his shin on a chair or something, and you know it's clear that this guy thinks he's in pain, but it's perfectly sensible to think that that actually it's not really bad enough to be pain. It's just his self-pity which makes him think that it's pain. So those are just completely commonsensical examples, quite easy to think of, where those sentences are totally fine. Now, of course, I mean we all overlook certain cases, but the thing is, the way in which Paul is neglecting these cases, which are crucially relevant to what he's claiming, it involves a kind of cavalierness with the data, which is exactly the fault that he accuses tea philosophers of. And I mean, we're also getting on the basis of absolutely minimal evidence, the postulation of a rule of English. Actually, we're not even told what the rule is. We're just told that there is a rule of English, not one which seems to be known to linguists, as far as I'm aware of, which outlaws such utterly ordinary utterances. I mean, that's an example of the kind of reckless theorizing which is supposed to be characteristic of tea philosophy. So, I mean, part of what he's doing in this kind of the ordinary use of the word philosophy is to say that it removes, quotes, the worry that other people's pain might be different from our own. Now, what he's given is a description of the use of the word pain, which involves all sorts of relations between pain and overt matters, such as cries of pain and situations of injury or whatever it is. And now we're supposed to be considering the worry that other people's pain might be different from our own. So it would seem, if we're adopting this kind of ordinary language methodology, that we should be interested in the way in which ordinary language differentiates different sorts of pain. And of course, it does that. So, I mean, if you go to the doctor complaining about a pain, the doctor may ask you, is it a throbbing pain? But, I mean, notice that the phrase throbbing pain is not associated with special kinds of behavior, other than answering yes to the question, is it throbbing pain or something? But it's not associated with non-linguistic throbbing, with non-linguistic behavior in any special way, at least anything that's sort of registered in the language. So that the description of the use of the word pain doesn't actually extend in the required way to exactly the vocabulary that would be relevant if we were concerned with the way in which ordinary language differentiates types of pain. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that any of this rehabilitates the mystery of pain in the way that some philosophers of consciousness might want it. But I think the point is simply that what Paul is doing in passages like these is just tea philosophy that is suffering from the sorts of defects which he regards as characteristic of tea philosophy. Another case I won't mention in detail, but he talks in the book about the use theory of meaning, which involves postulating for each word some central basic regularity for its use, which is supposed to explain all other aspects of its use. I mean, this postulation, at least in the book, and actually even in I think Paul's other writings, is based on extremely little evidence, and also has a number of problematic features. Such as the fact that although these basic regularities are supposed to be what fundamentally explains the use of the rest of the word, and by the way, this theory is supposed to make it potentially obvious that, or it's supposed to be potentially obvious that meaning is use, the regularities typically involve assent to sentences, the basic regularities that involve lots of other words as well, such that you could understand the word in question without understanding those other words, and so presumably wouldn't assent. So, I mean, I don't want to labor this, but it's clear that what we're dealing with is highly speculative theorizing of a kind typical of the sort of tea philosophy that Paul doesn't like, on the basis of very little evidence. Now, if you could argue by the highest standards of tea philosophy that tea philosophy is irrational, then maybe that would constitute some sort of reductio ad absurdum of tea philosophy. Perhaps not making it exactly obvious, but I mean not making the conclusion that it's irrational obvious. But I mean that would have some force as some kind of reductio ad absurdum of tea philosophy. But the thing is that the kinds of considerations that Paul is giving, they do not meet the highest standards of contemporary tea philosophy. They fall well short. I mean, although many tea philosophers do worse, there are plenty who are more careful in their analysis of data and their attention to evidence than in these cases. So what we've got is something that is more like a flawed statistical argument for the irrationality of statistical argument, which, I mean, it might constitute some kind of useful warning of the need for care in statistical arguments, the need for high standards in statistical argument, but it would not show that statistical argument itself is irrational. So similarly, although one might take Paul's book as constituting a useful warning of the need for high standards in tea philosophy, it does not constitute some kind of argument by reductio ad absurdum for the conclusion that tea philosophy is irrational. Another aspect of Paul's arguments that is worth mentioning is that many of them tend to overgenerate in the sense that if they were cogent, they would apply to lots of other branches of inquiry beyond philosophy itself. So, I mean, for example, one case is that, Paul's been arguing that you can't have a subject which arrives a priori at non-obvious results. And then he considers the objection, well, but isn't arithmetic an example of a subject which is in good standing but purports to arrive a priori at non-obvious results? And then Paul's response is, well, arithmetic is different because, well, to quote, it arrives at its number-theoretic conclusions by demonstrative proof rather than by the forms of conjectural inference relied upon in tea philosophy. Now, of course, it's true that formal proof plays a vastly greater role in mathematics than it does in philosophy. But what the response crucially neglects is the status of the axioms or other first principles of demonstrative proof. Now, of course, a little bit depends on your philosophy of mathematics, what we regard those first principles as being. I mean, if we treated arithmetic as basic, then we'd be, for example, considering the principle of mathematical induction and Peano's other axioms, if we were regarding arithmetic as reduced to set theory, then we'd be talking about the axioms of set theory. But that issue doesn't really matter for my purposes. The point is, when you actually look at the way in which first principles of demonstrative proof are supported in logic and mathematics, what you find are just the kinds of speculative, abductive reasoning, appeals to simplicity, stretched uses of the imagination, and so on, of the kind which Paul condemns in philosophy. So, in fact, the analogy in those respects between mathematics and philosophy is not mistaken in the crucial respect, provided that one remembers that the relevant part of mathematics are the first principles. In relation to considerations of simplicity, which Paul calls an irrational distortion that tends to occur when the demand for simplicity is carried over from empirical science to a priori philosophy. Those appeals to simplicity play a crucial role in consideration of axioms for set theory, particularly of new axioms of set theory. So it's not as though philosophy is the only broadly a priori discipline in which such appeals to simplicity are made, and I take it that they're perfectly legitimate in mathematics. Paul also asserts that in the a priori domain we cannot reasonably deploy the picture of increasingly profound layers of reality, end of quote. But actually, if you talk to mathematicians and logicians, you'll find that they deploy that picture a lot. It's very something that you hear over and over again from mathematicians, is how new results give a deeper understanding of old results. So to a much greater extent than I think Paul realized, his critique of philosophy, if it were cogent, would have devastating ramifications for logic and mathematics as well. I think his arguments also have a rather uneasy relationship with the special sciences, so whether non-fundamental, natural, and social sciences. So Paul criticizes systematization in philosophy on the grounds that, quotes, in all but a few cases, the complexity of our data makes it unreasonable to expect interesting results. And another quotation. If a complex systematization is all that can be achieved, then there are bound to be equally good alternatives, in which case we won't have legitimate epistemic norms that will enable us to decide between them. And I mean, if those considerations were cogent, they wouldn't just tell against philosophy, they would tell against psychology, biology, and a bunch of other disciplines which also have to deal in complexities. Another issue concerns the role of idealization in science. I mean, when Paul's talking about science, he describes the use of ideal laws as, quote, a common and legitimate feature of scientific theorizing. And he correctly notes that, quotes, the standardly desired blend of empirical adequacy, simplicity, and explanatory power is sometimes best achieved by means of a theory whose two-pronged form is to postulate certain ideal laws or ceteris paribus laws and certain distorting factors, end of quote. And I mean, I sort of broadly agree with what he's saying about the scientific case there, but I mean, the natural question is, why shouldn't philosophers be allowed to use idealization in their work in a similar way? I mean, in fact, they do. I mean, I would regard formal epistemology as a successful branch of philosophy in which idealization is used a lot. I mean, it's formal epistemology that is concerned with probabilistic reasoning and with epistemic logic, where sort of we're kind of in many cases we're idealizing away from limitations on subjects' computational abilities, but in a way that seems entirely appropriate and leads to illuminating results. And then a final way in which it seems that some kind of double standard is at work is in the treatment of data, where Paul regards tea philosophers as really cavalier in just dismissing any data that don't suit their theories in a way that he thinks scientists would never do. But I mean, the way he describes this is just that the data that tea philosophers dismiss are observations made by normal subjects in normal conditions. But of course, scientists themselves don't think that they have to accept every observation made by normal subjects in normal conditions at face value. I mean, if some normal observers in normal conditions tell an astronomer that they saw the sun rise, it's not that those astronomers feel, oh, we've got to respect our data, so let's go back to the geocentric universe or something. Of course, they entirely properly reserve the right to second-guess judgments made by normal observers in normal conditions. And it seems to me that tea philosophers do the same thing. I mean, if you look at not only the very best examples of contemporary philosophy, but just as were normally good ones, you see that people do not lightly dismiss what one might call observations made by normal observers in normal conditions. I mean, they give some kind of explanation of why they think a mistake could have arisen. So it seems to me that there just is not the sort of stark contrast between the practice of scientists and the practice of tea philosophers that Paul is claiming. Another point where I think Paul's being unfair to tea philosophy is that he describes it as starting from an unwarranted sort of scientific presumption that the given abstract domain satisfies simple yet deeply hidden laws. But in many cases, actually no such presumption is needed. I mean, I'll give an example from my most recent book, Modal Logic as Metaphysics, as we're just to get in a bit of self-advertising. So, in a way, the central project of that book is to ask what are the true principles of quantified modal logic. So we have a certain formal language which involves modal operators, which for the purposes of this enterprise are being interpreted as standing for metaphysical possibility and metaphysical necessity, and we've got quantifiers which are understood as unrestricted, and then when we're asking what the true principles of quantified modal logic are, we're asking which formulas in this language are true on every assignment of values of the appropriate type to their variables and non-logical constants. And the enterprise does not involve assuming that a whole lot of these principles are indeed true in that and correspond to true generalizations in that sense, because if in fact it turned out that none of them are, that they're all invalid, in the sense just described. That itself would be a fantastically interesting result. That would be a really, really major discovery in modal metaphysics, that it's to this extraordinary extent. Of course, that is not the situation. I mean, the real situation is that there are lots and lots of generalizations that we do know hold under all such interpretations. These are metaphysical claims. I mean, they're claims about metaphysical modality and about everything that there is. And many of them, I think, are really true beyond any sensible argument. Others are highly controversial, including the ones that I spend most of the book investigating. Now, of course, Paul may not be interested in that enterprise. Nobody's saying that he has to be. But it doesn't seem to me that there's anything particularly irrational about this enterprise. And there's no special reason to think that it's doomed to failure, because after all, it's already had, over the past 60 years or whatever, it's already had considerable success. It's just a matter of how much further that can be taken, whether we can, as it were, come, or how close we can come to completing that enterprise. Now, of course, one form of traditional Wittgensteinian riposte to such a claim would be that these formulas, under the interpretation that I've given them, just lack any proper meaning, and so the questions really don't arise. But it's an important and I think actually refreshing and attractive feature of Paul's book that he doesn't play the implausible meaninglessness card. That a card which has done much to discredit the attempted Wittgensteinian critiques in the eyes of most philosophers. But because he's not claiming that the questions that I and lots of other people are interested in are meaningless, and because he hasn't really done anything much to show that the kind of broadly abductive methods that we're using in pursuing these questions are hopeless, it seems to me that he's really not given us much of a case to worry about. So, just to conclude, as I say, I'm not going to say anything about whether the metaphilosophy that Paul's supporting is indeed Wittgenstein's, but it does seem to me that if it's Wittgenstein's, then and if it's Wittgenstein's main contribution to philosophy, then Wittgenstein was not a philosopher of much consistency or depth. And I therefore predict that most Wittgenstein scholars will find Horwich's interpretation unfaithful. Thanks very much.
Tim, thank you. Really, I owe a great deal to Tim in this project. I'd like to thank him for the correspondence we had on these matters a couple of years ago, which was very helpful to me. And now I have to thank him for reading the book, the new book, writing a review of it, And I think, I'm not sure how this came about, but he maybe suggested that there be a discussion of it at these meetings. And of course I have to thank Maria too for agreeing to that suggestion, if that's indeed how it came about. Okay, now I'm actually especially appreciative of this attention, since one of the substantial misgivings I had about the whole project was that Wittgenstein had fallen so far out of favor amongst professional philosophers that no one would have any interest in the book, except perhaps for some hardcore Wittgensteinians who would dismiss it for being so unscholarly. Anyway, so I am relieved and very pleased to be here. And no matter that Tim is vehemently opposed and punches hard, one would much rather be condemned than ignored. And at least I do now have the opportunity to try and persuade you that his punches can be deflected. So here goes. I'm going to begin with a summary of my line of thought, although Kevin did already a pretty good job, and Tim also. But still, I'd like to get my version of it out there, which I think is somehow importantly different and helps to address later on when I turn to responding to Tim's criticisms. So, as Tim said, I've been trying to develop a certain metaphilosophical position, the essence of which, not in every detail, but the essence of which I believe can be read into Wittgenstein. And in a nutshell, the position is that one of the dominant approaches within Western philosophy is intrinsically irrational. And it's true, irrational is my negative term of choice here, rather than meaningless or rubbish, irrational. Anyway, that approach to the subject, the approach that I'm saying Wittgenstein is criticizing, which is the approach I'm calling T-philosophy, as he said, to suggest traditional and theoretical. That approach is characterized by the assumption that abductive reasoning from intuitive data is likely to uncover fundamental regularities. Thus, T-philosophy might be called not scientific, but scientistic. Just as the scientific method issues in profound and sometimes radical theoretical discoveries, so the T-philosopher expects her armchair reasoning to deliver such results as well. Now, my Wittgenstein-inspired critique of T-philosophy combines a general argument to show that this presupposition is irrational, with illustrations from throughout the subject of the various ways in which that irrationality is manifested. So here I am a little bit taking issue with Tim's presentation of my position. It's not merely that I'm looking at case studies. I think a general argument can be made. And it's the general argument that I now want to sketch, but is in the book as well. So I have a sort of series of 5 points that make up this argument. First, I note that our concepts and the intuitive data involving them tend to be messy. They can rarely be captured by simple definitions, simple rules, or simple conceptual roles. Nor is there any common shape to them. Even restricting ourselves to monadic predicative concepts, we see a bewildering variety from one to another in how they're used and what they are good for. And I think that's especially so with respect to the concepts of philosophical interests, such as truth, goodness, consciousness, person, knowledge, Now this complexity that I'm emphasizing is hardly surprising, given that our concepts were not designed by logicians, but evolved to serve a variety of purposes and to serve them in a way that conduces to the complex and often conflicting contingencies of our nature, our culture, and our environment. That's the first point. Concepts are messy. Second, I point out that the similarly messy empirical data with which the sciences must contend are often largely explainable in terms of simple principles concerning postulated entities and properties at some underlying level, in conjunction with a messy spatiotemporal array of circumstantial factors. But there's no hope for the complex intuitive data associated with a messy concept to be explained in that sort of way. For a priori reality has nothing analogous to conjectured theoretical entities, physical layers, and spatiotemporal arrays. So that's the second point. And although the sciences also have to deal with messy data, they have a way of handling it that isn't going to be open to an a priori philosophical theoretician. Third, I remind the reader that in T-philosophy, what often happens instead, in the pursuit of simplicity, what often happens instead is that simplicity is obtained on the cheap by finding a simple regularity that fits a good part of the intuitive data and deeming incorrect all the intuitions that it doesn't fit. Consider, for example, the epistemological theory that a belief can be reasonable only if there's argumentative support for it. Second example, the metanormative theory that no belief is intrinsically motivating, ignoring normative beliefs. And thirdly, the metaphysical theory that every object, property, and fact is naturalistic. Fourth point, I observe that this strategy is an unwarranted distortion of the norm of simplicity deployed in science. There, simplicity is not taken to trump data without further ado. Yes, an observation may well be discounted if its circumstances suggest unreliability. But the methodology of T-philosophy allows for intuitive data to be dismissed solely on the grounds that not doing so would spoil the party. Fifth, I do grant that not all philosophers make this mistake. Many will allow more responsibly that all the data, unless independently underminable, must be respected. But in that case, a beautifully simple theory will so rarely be obtainable that one has no right to expect it. Less demanding standards of simplicity can be met, but such standards will let in a variety of proposals, and the remaining epistemic norms won't be constraining enough to decide amongst them. Thus, a profusion of alternative theories will emerge with no prospect of convergence on some best one. This situation is all too familiar. Consider, just for a couple of examples, the competing theories of ethics, and on a narrower front, the explosion of so-called solutions to the liar paradoxes. Now, I'm afraid that this series of 5 points amounts to an awfully sketchy and simplified summary of my basis for thinking that T-philosophy is irrational. But I hope at least to have got across the rough idea. Now, turning now to Tim's responses to the richer argument elaborated in the book, as you've heard, his overall conclusion is that this argument is seriously flawed and quite unconvincing. Now, for the sake of my reply, I'd like to divide into 3 groups the specific points he makes in support of that conclusion. In the first group, which I take to be the most important, he criticizes 4 assumptions that I do indeed rely on, all related to the prospects for simplicity in a priori philosophical theorizing. It's a mistake, he says, to think that the tea philosopher's practice of discounting certain data is any less legitimate than the parallel practice in science. Furthermore, it's a mistake to think that there are no increasingly profound explanatory layers in a priori domains. It's also a mistake to think that tea philosophers cannot follow science in achieving simplicity by postulating ceteris paribus laws. And lastly, it's a mistake to assume that a tea philosopher's investigation into which simple principles govern a given domain, like quantified modal logic or something like that, it's a mistake to think that the tea philosopher's investigation into which simple principles govern a given domain presupposes that some principles do. Okay, this is just basically a list so far. Now, Tim's second group of criticisms, which I regard as somewhat less central, I still take them seriously, but I think they're less central, accuse me in effect of a self-undermining hypocrisy, of engaging in just the forms of oversimplification and theoretical speculation that I'm complaining about in tea philosophy. I'm guilty of one or another of these sins, he feels, when I maintain that it's linguistically anomalous to say he thinks he's in pain, but perhaps he's mistaken. Also, when I fail to recognize that not all pains are of the same phenomenological kind. Also, when I claim that red things look red in normal circumstances. They didn't mention this one today. For what about blind people? And also when I propose what is plainly a theoretical conjecture, that each word's meaning what it does consists in the non-semantic regularity governing its overall use. Okay, that's the second group. Then there's Tim's third sort of concern, namely that my criticism of tea philosophy would have some untoward consequences. It would imply that philosophy departments are a waste of money and should be closed down. And it would generalize to other fields, threatening to destroy not just philosophy, but mathematics, linguistics, psychology, and biology. Okay, that's the list of the objections I'm up against. Now let me try to take them one at a time without panicking and briefly explain why I'm not yet persuaded. Okay, I begin with Tim's suggestion that the tea philosopher's common practice of data dismissal, enabling the preservation of simple theories, is not, as I say it is, an irrational distortion of the legitimate scientific practice of data dismissal. Here I'm going to hold my ground. Yes, a scientist too will sometimes discount observations, even some that are very widely agreed on and that are made in perfectly good conditions. One of Tim's nice examples of this, as he mentioned, is the shared observation each morning that the sun is rising. But the independent justification for discounting in that case is that these observation reports are laden with a questionable theory. Moreover, the observations are not entirely thrown away, even if discounted. Rather, a less committal articulation is provided of what is actually seen, something that is respected on all sides. In tea philosophy, on the other hand, data are often dismissed for no other reason than that they would falsify a lovely theory. And this is what I'm saying is irrational. Now, my hunch, strong hunch, is that Tim himself would probably agree with this. He would probably concede that this sort of tea philosophy, including the 3 examples I gave at the beginning, 3 examples of its products, that this kind of tea philosophy is indeed unhealthy. But, okay, let's not forget, though, how very widely that strategy is deployed. Next, I'd like to address his objection to my claim that there's no genuine explanatory depth in a priori theorizing, as there is in science. In fact, I don't and didn't deny his observation made just now that when the multitude of facts in some a priori domain are derivable from a few simple principles, the axioms, we can aptly speak of that multitude of facts having been explained in terms of deeper ones. The context of my denial of a priori theoretical depth was my claim that a tea philosopher cannot hope to deal with messy data in anything like the way I mentioned that is common within science. That is, by postulating simple laws at deeper physical levels, generally laws governing smaller entities, and explaining the data as the product of those underlying laws in conjunction with a spatio-temporal array of additional factors. Moving on to a related point of Tim's, he applauds my recognition that a somewhat different route to simplicity is also used in science. But he complains that I overlook its equally useful application in tea philosophy. This alternative strategy, this idea, is that instead of explaining the messy data in the way just described as resulting in part from a law that holds at some lower level, we explain the data as resulting from an idealized or ceteris paribus law at the original superficial level, i.e. what would happen superficially in idealized or, quote, normal circumstances, normal conditions. We explain, and then we can join that so-called idealized law with a battery of further principles specifying which circumstances make the conditions abnormal or less than ideal, and what differences their presence would make. Now, Tim is certainly right that I didn't consider the use of this strategy in tea philosophy, the second one. But that's because no cases of such theorizing occurred to me. And I think that's not really surprising, because I think that the prospects of substantiating talk of idealized a priori principles with a further story about what the non-ideal factors are and what distortions their presence would imply just seems too causal to apply in a priori domains. Now, I'm not here forgetting Tim's suggestion that the strategy in question is in fact deployed in philosophy within formal epistemology suggested. For example, it is commonly supposed that an ideally rational person would know all the logical truths. But I think that this sort of thing is not in fact parallel to what happens in the special sciences when ceteris paribus laws are postulated. Instead, what I think we find in formal epistemology, in examples like the one I just gave, are principles of rationality that are recognized as simply incorrect, but whose blend of approximate truth and simplicity makes them useful to work with for certain purposes. So they have an instrumental value. But might these purposes not be theoretical, Tim would say? Well, my apologies for the impending argument from authority, especially when the alleged authority is me. But I've argued in some earlier work, for instance, there's a paper of mine called Wittgensteinian Bayesianism, that the answer is no. They can't be, used in theoretical work, or at least in good theoretical work. That the only real value of such so-called idealizations is therapeutic. They provide a framework, what Wittgenstein would have called a perspicuous representation, that helps us dissolve various paradoxes and puzzles concerning scientific methodology that arise when belief is taken to be all or nothing, an all or nothing matter, and when degrees of belief are wrongly neglected. Another way in which, according to Tim, I distort the methodology of T-philosophy is in supposing there to be a background expectation that simple theories will be discovered. He observes that a philosophical investigation into whether or not a given simple principle holds within a given domain doesn't at all presuppose that some simple general principles do hold there. And he asked rhetorically how it could be irrational for anyone interested in the issue to engage in that investigation. But I do say a couple of things in the book that bear on this question. First, I acknowledge that many philosophers, and Tim is one of them, don't insist on an unreasonably high degree of simplicity. But then I argue that they will then have to confront a variety of alternative theoretical proposals with little prospect of the issue ever being settled. And in the second place, I allow that each of us certainly does have a prima facie right to investigate whatever we want, just as we have the right to pursue any of our desires, no matter how idiosyncratic or difficult to satisfy they may be. But the objective value of such an investigation that one simply wants to engage in is greatly diminished, perhaps entirely removed, in the absence of any reason to think that it will yield a determinate answer. Regarding the particular example that Tim offers in this connection, his own concern with the most general logical truths about metaphysical necessity, I'd concede that there may well be some pretty clear cases of such truths. But as Tim admits, many candidate principles, for instance the Barkan formula, are controversial. And I can't see why we should be any more optimistic that we can settle such questions as we are about settling analogous questions in the formal theory of truth. On the contrary, at least truth is a clear and familiar concept, whereas metaphysical necessity has come to the fore within analytic philosophy only in the last 40 years or so. I'm thinking of Kripke's work. Its nature and its relations to other brands of necessity, for instance, logical, mathematical, conceptual, scientific, normative, and, necessities of identity. So its nature and relations to these other branches of necessity remain highly controversial, and its very existence may yet turn out to be an illusion. Metaphysical necessity, I mean. But if we philosophers don't really know what, if anything, we are referring to with the term metaphysically necessary, then one might be forgiven for suspecting that Tim's formal investigation of it is premature. Let me now turn to his second group of objections, those suggesting that my critique of T-philosophy trades in some of the very practices of irrational overgeneralization and theoretical conjecture that I am condemning. One of his examples is drawn from my discussion of experience. Following Wittgenstein, I was pointing to the facts about our use of the word pain and other mental terms that seduce us into the idea from which I think all the main mysteries of consciousness derive. Namely, that each of us defines the word pain ostensibly by reference to our own pain qualia, and that as a consequence, some supporting argument is always going to be needed to justify our application of the term to other people on the basis of the usual behavioral and circumstantial evidence. So that was what I was trying to do, and I describe one of these facts of usage that seduce us into that picture as follows. I'm quoting from myself. A person saying, quote, "I am in pain," is not normally to be challenged except with regard to linguistic competence and sincerity. Each person is normally treated as the ultimate authority on his own experiences. Thus, and this is the part that Tim alluded to, thus, quote, "he thinks he is in pain, but perhaps he's mistaken," end quote, and, quote, "I'm not sure if I'm in pain," end quote, are considered deviant, anomalous, a sort of violation of linguistic rules. Okay, Tim is right that there are contexts in which it would be quite appropriate to come out with those sentences at the end. To be scrupulous, that final remark of mine should have been qualified with normalies or usuallys or something like that, as were my ways of putting the point earlier in the passage. So it seems to me the repair is pretty obvious. And more importantly, though, it wouldn't appear to make any significant difference to the Wittgensteinian diagnosis of problematic qualia talk that I was trying to sketch. So I'm not really seeing here a solid case of making the very mistake one is criticizing. It's one thing to do as I did and take what I think is a harmless shortcut for expository purposes. It's another thing to defend one's radical theoretical conclusions against intuitive counterexamples without being able to explain why those intuitions should be discounted. A further alleged instance of my own tendency to overgeneralize is that my discussion of pain talk supposedly overlooks or denies the existence of different kinds of pain. For instance, the difference between throbbing pains and other kinds of pain. And yes, I do indeed claim to remove, and now quoting for myself, repeating the quote from myself that Tim gave, I do indeed claim to remove the worry that other people's pain may be different from our own, may be different from our pain. But it's crystal clear, I think, in the context of that remark of mine in the book, that the worry I'm talking about here is one that hinges on a commitment to qualia. It's parallel to the notorious inverted spectrum problem. The general question is this: when someone else has experience of type E, no matter how finely described that is in English, that experience, that type, experience type, how can I know whether what it's like for them is the same as what it's like for me when I have E? And my point was simply that if, as Wittgenstein argues, there are no qualia, then this question is undermined. I was certainly not denying, as Tim appears to think I was, that there's a difference between a pain that's throbbing and one that isn't. Now, I do have to concede that one of Tim's accusations of inconsistency is not so easy for me to dismiss. And this, I think, parallels one of Kevin's points or questions to me. This is the objection that Wittgenstein's anti-theoretical metaphilosophy cannot be squared with maintaining that the meaning of a word is a matter of its non-semantic use. In anticipation of this familiar criticism, I argue in the book that Wittgenstein's definition of meaning, I'm using his word definition, Wittgenstein's definition of meaning really is a definition, that it really is implicit in our use of the word meaning, or in a use of the word meaning, and that it's no more of a speculative conjecture than is any other proposed definition, for instance, of bachelor. And so it isn't a theory of the sort that Wittgenstein thinks must be avoided. Now, I do appreciate that Tim will not be alone in regarding these considerations as unconvincing. But I myself have yet to see what's wrong with them. Still, just in case I do come to see it, I might mention my plan B. If I had to retreat from my present position, which is that it is a definition, a good definition, if I had to retreat from my present position, it would be to admit that the account of meaning as use is an empirical constitution theory on a par with water is H2O, or that water property of being water is constituted by the property of being made of H2O molecules. So such a theory, which, just like Plan A, would not be at odds with my critique of T-philosophy, because, of course, that proposal wouldn't count as T-philosophy, it would be an empirical proposal. So consistency would be restored between a view of meaning and a view of nature philosophy. I now turn quickly to Tim's third group of concerns, to the two kinds of undesirable import that he says my line of argument would appear to have. The first is that, if correct, its destructive reach would extend to fields beyond philosophy. And the second is that philosophy departments would be under threat. With respect to its relevance to mathematics, Tim notes that my critique would impugn the project of identifying axioms. He doesn't mention that I say exactly the same thing myself in the book. Nor does he tell us what is wrong with supposing, as I do, that such projects are best regarded as part of the philosophy of mathematics, mathematics itself being restricted demonstrative proof. I can't see anyone being awarded the Field Medal, which I guess is like the Nobel Prize for mathematics, for a nice abductive argument supporting certain axioms of arithmetic. And regarding the relevance of my argument to empirical domains, Tim notes my skepticism about the prospects of finding simple systematizations of the intuitive a priori data concerning some phenomenon, and my observation that our empirical norms won't be constraining enough to decide between complex theoretical alternatives. And he wonders why the same points, the same potentially destructive points, wouldn't undermine such high-level sciences as linguistics, psychology, and biology. My answer is basically to repeat the point I've already made several times, namely that the sciences often can and should deal with their messy superficial data by postulating theoretical entities and simple laws at a more basic level. And that doesn't imply handing over responsibility to some more fundamental science, even within the same science. That is done. Thus, linguistics became a respectable science only after Chomsky's demolition of behavioral linguistics, which stayed at the superficial level, and his postulation of hidden structures within the mind. Clearly, a similar story could be told about psychology. As for biology, I confess I know virtually nothing about it, but it does seem clear that its explanatory power was enormously increased with the development of molecular biology. Finally, let me address Tim's expression of concern for what my critique would seem to imply about the future of academic philosophy. He says, and I quote from what he read, on the picture that emerges from my critique, 90% of philosophy is a waste of space, while the remaining 10% consists of praiseworthy demolitions of the 90%. Horwich does not explain why taxpayers should be expected to fund a branch of the academy with that structure. And he is absolutely right that I don't explain this. But I must say that that's in part because Tim's hypothetical is rather a peculiar one. How could it happen that the unsophisticated taxpayers are able to recognize that Wittgenstein's critique of T-philosophy is correct, while the T-philosophers themselves can't manage to see this? Anyway, I wasn't and am not trying to dodge an uncomfortable question or trying to avoid facing up to the enormity of what I was arguing. And I'm happy now to venture some plausible explanations of why someone endorsing my critique of T-philosophy might not advocate the closing of philosophy departments. I have 4 explanations. They might all be true. They're not incompatible, I don't think. One possible explanation is that tea philosophy is in fact still growing strong. And we might well prefer that its practitioners be rationally persuaded to abandon it rather than simply starved into extinction. Another explanation is that, like me, myself, one may think that the critique is correct, but not be sure that it is. So one may well find it reasonable to wait for more decisive considerations to emerge. A third explanation is the one that Tim himself mentions, that the refined critical techniques in which some philosophers are peculiarly expert can be valuably applied, but without such destructive import in other fields. And it's not just wishful thinking that there wouldn't be such destructive import. Of course, the criticism I advanced was supposed to be about the whole enterprise of tea philosophy, but in these, what one expects is that when these critical skills are applied in other domains, they will be applied in cases where the scientists or whatever have made somehow specific mistakes in specific areas. There's no presumption or intent or desire to destroy the whole field. So yes, that could be a motive also for keeping philosophers in business, their value more generally in other fields. And a fourth explanation may issue from the fact that there are, and this is something I say in the book, there are many intellectual activities legitimately called philosophy, besides either tea philosophy or the Wittgensteinian therapeutic treatments of it. And some of these other activities could be worthwhile. So philosophy departments could be full of people doing these other things. In particular, I think a particularly important example, there's the popular Quinian conception of the subject, whereby philosophy is a posteriori and continuous with the sciences. That has not been under Wittgensteinian attack, and that could be useful and continued. So there are a number of reasonable answers, I think, to Tim's question. But whether the taxpayers would think along any of these lines, I can't say. So that's it for my response to Tim, but I would like to finish with a concluding confession. I have to admit that the end of tea philosophy would give me no satisfaction whatsoever. I myself have had an enormous amount of fun engaging in it, and still do. But, as we all know, reasoning sometimes takes you where you don't really want to go. Thank you.
Tim and Paul were exactly 35 minutes each, and we're just going to have 5 minutes from Tim and then open it up for another 30.
Right. I think the only part of what Paul was saying that I'll reply to are his comments on the first two groups of criticism, just to keep this short. I won't say anything about his rehearsal of the original argument or about the abolition of philosophy concern. So one thing he says about the handling of data is that in tea philosophy, on the other, data are often dismissed for no other reason than that they would falsify a lovely theory. That's irrational. Now my strong sense is that Tim himself would probably agree. I don't. It seems to me that actually just dismissing data on the grounds that they don't fit the theory is not something that, for example, referees of journals are in the least happy about in contemporary analytic philosophy. I think that sometimes, I don't think even this is so widespread, but sometimes what you get are people saying, well, that there are certain problems for this theory which have not yet been resolved, but in general it looks so good that we're still sort of betting that in the long run it's going to overcome them. And that's exactly parallel to what Kuhn describes in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where even in normal science, the dominant paradigms are still have anomalies that haven't been resolved, but it can be rational for people to maintain such paradigms. So I don't think there is such an asymmetry in the treatment of data, as Paul's suggesting. Now, yeah, maybe something about the role of idealizations, where, well, actually, Paul focused on ceteris paribus laws, and he suggests that those aren't what we find in formal epistemology. But idealizations, which are what he was mostly talking about, they're not exactly the same thing as ceteris paribus laws. I mean, for example, I take it in astronomy, an idealization would be when you treat planets as point masses. I mean, it's not that ceteris paribus planets are point masses. It's just that we treat them as point masses because, well, otherwise the mathematics is just completely intractable, and we can get good approximations by doing so. And I think that the treatment of the knowing subject in epistemic logic as ideally rational is an idealization of that sort. So again, it seems to me that there is actually quite a close parallel between the philosophical and scientific cases. And Paul suggests that the purposes that we're pursuing with these idealizations or ceteris paribus generalizations in philosophy, that we're not really achieving any useful theoretical purpose. I mean, in the case of epistemic logic, which is one that I'm familiar with, I think it's very clear that we are pursuing theoretical purposes. So, for example, I mean, one use of epistemic logic in recent years has been to understand the interactions between different levels, between knowledge and knowledge of knowledge, or between evidence and evidence about evidence. And it seems to me that these idealized models have cast very considerable light on those issues, and those issues are important theoretical ones. So Paul suggests that the kind of pursuit that I'm engaging in modal logic as metaphysics is going to be one where we just end with sort of intractable issues that there's no prospect or there's no reason to think that we can settle. I mean, of course, quantified modal logic is a new subject in which a lot has already been settled, and it's one where, in fact, the competing theories are not intractably complex, but some of them are considerably more complex than others. I mean, I'm arguing in the book that if we go to the setting of higher order languages, we can see the differences between these theories in theoretical virtue emerging considerably more clearly than in the first order case. I don't see any reason whatsoever to think that's an enterprise that can't eventually resolve the questions that it's pursuing. Paul, in relation to that, Paul also played the meaninglessness card, or sort of, as it were, hinted at playing it, which is one that he specifically refrained from playing in the book. I'll just say that in the Philosophy of Philosophy, I give an account of how the notion of metaphysical possibility necessity can be explained in terms of counterfactual conditionals, which are things that we all use anyway, and how that explanation also gives us the beginnings of an epistemology for such claims. Now moving on to the use of the word pain. I mean, Paul suggests that, all right, he did generalize over rashly, but all that's required is to stick a normally in front of what he said, or something like that. It seems to me that, well, it's not in the least clear with something like he thinks he's in pain, but perhaps he's mistaken. Which is something where, as it were, if one comes to it cold, one thinks, what the hell's going on? But supposing I were to say to you that somebody thinks he's licking his lips, but perhaps he's mistaken. I mean, I think one's initial reaction to that is, what the hell is going on here? I mean, of course, then one can use one's ingenuity to think of circumstances in which somebody could be mistaken about that. But as it were, the initial sense of how the hell could that, what the hell is he talking about, seems to me is the same. I don't think Paul's given any reason to think that these are fundamentally different cases. So, in particular, the idea that some kind of linguistic rule is involved, whether it's an exceptionless rule or a rule that somehow just holds for the most part, that I mean, heavens knows what kind of rule it would be, I think is the prospects for such an account look very, very weak. So that actually the revision is not just a minor repair. It's that there was something wrong with the approach. By the way, I did not take Paul to be denying that there's a difference between a pain that's throbbing and one that isn't. All I was arguing for was that the speculations about one person's pain, which is, I mean, the way he formulated, one person's pain being different from another and so on. I mean, it's not that I'm not a skeptic about ascriptions of pain at all, but the data that would be relevant to those issues simply weren't really considered. So, in connection with the sort of worry that the meaning is use theory would be a philosophical theory, that, as it were, Paul's plan A is to say, okay, it's a definition, it's implicit in our use of the word, and the plan B is to say it's an empirical constitution theory. So if some Kantian or utilitarian were putting forward some surprising theory of the good, I mean, their plan A could be that it's some kind of definition that's really implicit in our use of the word, just takes a bit of work to get it explicit, and their plan B could be that it's an empirical constitution theory. I think empirical here, I take it, well, Paul's model is water is H2O, which again, I take it is a case of the necessary but not the a priori. So we would still be dealing with necessary truths, but one's which we arrived at by a route that didn't just consist of a priori theorizing. They would still be part of the practice of philosophy. In the case of mathematical axioms, Paul suggests that the sort of abductive project of giving abductive support to mathematical axioms is part of the philosophy of mathematics, not part of mathematics. That's actually just a mistake. If you look at the project of identifying new axioms for set theory, for example, axioms that would settle the continuum hypothesis and finding support for them, that's an enterprise which is continuing at the moment mainly in departments of mathematics. mathematicians like Hugh Wooden and so on are the leaders there. It's not a philosopher's project. I mean, philosophers are interested in it, but it's of course, it's as it were. It's not the most easily recognized sort of mathematics. As it were, it's a relatively unusual type of mathematical activity. It is too speculative to be a likely winner of the Fields Medal, but it's something that is taken utterly seriously by mathematicians themselves. So it can't just be consigned to philosophy of mathematics. And then just finally, on the issue about, well, why don't his appeals to the messiness of the data and so on, why aren't they a threat to linguistics, psychology, biology, and so on? That they deal with it by postulating theoretical entities and simple laws at a more basic level. But in the sense in which they do that, which is, I think, very often not a reductionist sense, but just a sense in which, I mean, for example, in linguistics, it's not that syntax is being reduced to neuroscience or something like that, but what linguists do is to formulate more theoretical notions than those available in, as it were, folk linguistics, because there's a much better chance of formulating universal generalizations are true in those terms. But those kinds of moves are equally open to tea philosophers and are frequently made by them.
I'm sure Paul would have something to say. He's kindly said we should open it up to questions.
Well, these are really just two questions to Paul and really a request for clarification more than anything. And it has more to do with your reasons for not closing down the philosophy departments than with regard to your critique of tea philosophy. So I just want to really stand vis-a-vis two questions. And the first one is with regard to, I can't think of a particularly good word for this, but something like the transformative role of philosophy, the way in which philosophy can change the way we see things. So maybe by opening up a new way of seeing things or reminding us of things that we may have forgotten. So is that a function you would attribute to philosophy and as something that has to be practiced in philosophy departments? And the second question it's really again a question for clarification of your own position. It seems to me that not all idealizations, and certainly have to do with, or not all idealizations in philosophy are attempts to disregard the messiness of everyday life. And one of the things that I think Tim mentioned was idealizations as thought experiments, where the idealization invites us to imagine a situation in which we can then explore the strengths and limits of certain ways of conceptualizations, ways of thinking about truth, for instance. So where do you stand vis-a-vis those kinds of idealizations?
Well, let me answer the first question. I'm still not completely understanding the second one. Should that kind of transformative philosophy, that kind of thing, I'm not sure I completely, can that kind of thing be done in a philosophy department? Well, yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, as I said, the term philosophy would be a good example of a Wittgensteinian, family resemblance concept. There is no clear definition of what it is. There are a bunch of different activities that are loosely related to one another. And, so you go into a bookshop and under the heading of philosophy, you see all kinds of stuff, some of which you would hate, you're not interested in, some of which you're more interested in. So I think it's kind of futile to be thinking about what is philosophy? It's just this, a bunch of different things. And all I was saying was that, okay, it's, as Tim says, so the book mainly was concerned with a particular thing that I think was Wittgenstein's target. So I introduced a special term so that I don't have to be saying even the terms traditional philosophy is too vague. I wanted something which could actually be defined by a certain kind of methodology. There's that target, and there's a kind of philosophizing which is a criticism of it. And that's what really the action was, but I certainly never wanted to suggest, and I think I say explicitly in the book, there are other things which I might think of some of them are valuable and others aren't, but that's got nothing to do with this. And one of them might well be this kind of philosophizing you're talking about. I mean, another kind that I did mention in my presentation was philosophy seen as kind of embryonic science, or the sort of thing that Quine was pursuing. So now could you ask again your question about idealization?
I wasn't sure whether you were being critical of idealizations in philosophy in general or just certain kinds of idealizations. And it would seem to me that idealizations, when they are thought experiments, have a valuable place in philosophy because they invite us into imaginary situations that enable us to explore the strengths and limitations of certain ways of thinking about truth.
I mean, if something is an exercise of the imagination, I'm not sure I necessarily call that an idealization. It's just pretending something, and that kind of thing certainly can be imagining something that isn't in fact real or couldn't really happen. I don't necessarily think of that as an idealization in the sense that we were talking about it. But I mean,
what if you're imagining an ideally rational subject, who's nevertheless may have other kinds of epistemic limitations?
But I don't see that you've really, if one puts it in that way, it's not clear that there's some definite thing that you are imagining. I mean, there are various kinds of idealization for various purposes. You'd have to say, well, I'm imagining, like if you say, look, I'm imagining planets as point masses, fine. That's one thing, but just to say I'm imagining an idealized planet, well, we don't know what we're doing yet. So you can certainly imagine something known to be false, and that can be useful, like the planets are point objects. I mean, I just think there is a bit of a problem here in that it's not our fault, but the word idealization is used in a bunch of different ways, and they should be really separated from one another.
But the question is how it's different between philosophy and science.
There's idealization in the sense of, getting towards what's really best. This is the best version of it. We don't really have in mind that. In the scientific case, one of the reasons I took issue with you was that you commented on a kind of technique used in science. You said, yes, that's right, that is used. And you said, well, why can't that be used in philosophy? The kind of thing that you quoted me as saying was a kind of case in science where you postulate so-called idealized, but maybe in this connection, we could just call them ceteris paribus laws.
I think those are very. I don't
well,
think you can
what I mean is
together,
something where you have, as you said, the two-pronged strategy. You have the law that's supposed to hold in ideal, or one might just say normal conditions, and then there are supposed to be the additional factors which make things not normal, and how then those factors being there, what difference they might make. And you hope to get an explanation of all the stuff in that two-pronged way. That, it seems to me, is not what's going on in the case of formal epistemology. At least, it seems to me that there is another thing one can do, a separate thing, which also might be called idealization, where you just simply, it's useful to suppose something known to be false, but approximately true and good enough for the time being, maybe good enough, so that is also done. That's not the same thing as where you postulate a combination of ceteris paribus laws plus further factors and so on. You just say, look, I'm just assuming that planets are point masses because it's mathematically tractable. I'm not saying, oh, well, really, everything is going to be explained by that assumption plus other assumptions. It's a different kind of thing. So in the case of epistemology, I think, of course, there is a kind of formal epistemology which is supposed to play into naturalized epistemology. In other words, psychology. In other words, empirical science. And maybe there you could say, okay, well, this is an idealization of the scientific kind. I'm going to assume people, in fact, empirically function in this kind of way, and I know it's not, I'm going to have to postulate some other factors to explain why they don't always do that. So there's idealization in empirical and formal epistemology naturalized. There's idealization in formal epistemology as part of tea philosophy, which is supposed to be sort of a priori or armchair. And I think there's idealization in the kind of therapeutic philosophy I myself would recommend, where, some simplified, known to be false model can be usefully deployed to help remove confusion in a purely instrumental way. So I'm not against idealization being used in philosophy, if it's used in therapeutic philosophy. I am against its being used in theoretical philosophy because of theoretical tea philosophy because of independent arguments against that. I'm not against it being used in epistemology naturalized. I'm nothing against epistemology naturalized.
Why shouldn't it be used in tea philosophy in the way that it's used in epistemic logic?
I just think it's because it's for the same reasons that I criticize that kind of theoretical project in a priori philosophy in other cases. It's just, you're going to assume, there isn't any way, I'm not seeing how you're going to get the combination of the idealized law and distorting factors coming together to explain particular things when it's not an empirical enterprise, because it seems to me causal.
Well, let me give let me give you an example. So one thing that you can do in epistemic logic, you make the idealization, which I would think of as subjects who are ideally rational in the sense that they can deduce all the consequences of what they know and know those and so on. And you make that because what you're interested in is not limitations on subjects' reasoning abilities, but let's say limitations on their knowledge induced by limitations on their powers of perceptual discrimination. And the reason that you make the idealization is because if you didn't make it, you'd be getting noise that was coming in from their limited powers, their limited logical powers, whereas what you want to study are their limited powers of perceptual discrimination. And so as a way, you remove the other limits so that you can study the limits that you're interested in. And this is something that's not done as something that's as incipiently empirical psychology or something like that. It's done as a branch of exact epistemology. And it involves idealizations carried out in a way that seems to me entirely in a scientific spirit.
Okay, Tim, I'm not going to convince you. I'm not seeing how this can be anything else.
Look, I've done these things. Oh. I don't think you. Of course, anybody who's been involved in model building in any science knows that you have to make all sorts of choices about the model, with choices which can be challenged, and that. As you do more model building, you get better at this, but it can still. You can still get effects which are artifacts of the model and so on. This is just common experience in all sciences that are involved in model building.
Well,
it's up to you to give us the slightest reason to think that it's significantly different in philosophy.
You yourself keep on saying model building in science. I've nothing against it. I'm not
Yeah,
talking about science.
But you're saying that somehow this is all okay. It's okay in science. It's not okay in philosophy. But you haven't given us any reason to think that.
Well, I think that, when you talk about, imagining a situation where there aren't perceptual limitations and so on, these are all empirical limitations. I'm not really seeing how that can be factored into some a priori account of things. I don't understand it. Maybe I'm sure I'm missing something, but I don't see that as how that could feed into anything else but an empirical inquiry.
Well, I mean, maybe you just haven't read the relevant things. I mean, these are all part of epistemology carried on in a way which is. I mean, if you could say, oh well, if any, as it were, mention of the fact that that for example, we don't have perfect eyesight is enough to make it a branch of empirical psychology. Then I mean, no doubt, vast swathes of what would of T philosophy would then count as empirical psychology. But the fact is, these enterprises which are carried out in a generally armchair way, as T philosophy tends to be, but nevertheless involve model building and seem to cast some light on the kind of phenomena that epistemologists have traditionally been interested in.
Hey, maybe we'll open up. We got about 5 people, so we'll have to go ahead, Paul.
Continuous, I guess, with some of these concerns. What I was having trouble with is getting a good fix on exactly what I should think T philosophy is, in such a way that it wouldn't raise immediately a kind of worry about self-refutation and critique. So it's a priori seems to be a very important part of characterizing what T philosophical enterprise. But of course, the a priori a posteriori distinction looked to be a very T philosophical distinction. In fact, one that's controversial within T philosophy. Discussing, so it looks like you need a fair amount of theoretical apparatus just to get that notion formulated, of just the kind that one would have thought you would object to. And the other thing, the other thing that puzzled me was the meaning as used, the definition. It seems as though you were suggesting that conceptual analysis is fine, that doesn't count as part of T philosophy. That was the only way in which I read. You were saying, well, that's like bachelor. Bachelor is an unmarried male. That's a definition. Meaning is used. That's a definition. So that's what traditionally used to be called conceptual analysis, and one would have thought a very big part of T philosophy. So I was very puzzled that you thought that was okay, and that left me worrying that it wasn't okay. And then plan B, which now made it empirical, that seemed to me to be even more puzzling, because that was now some kind of theoretical remark about the nature of something, like meaning, but where it wasn't clear how we would have been ever qualified to make that kind of theoretical conjecture, given that we're restricted to a priori methods, and this would have called for something different. And none of that seemed to me to sit well with what you were saying about the concepts being messy in such a way that no simple theory could ever give you an account of the role.
Okay. Okay, I'm seeing 3 issues. So you said, well, you're wondering how T philosophy can be defined in such a way that the question doesn't immediately arise as to whether it's not. The criticism of it, the critique of it wouldn't itself count as T philosophy. Or the view that T philosophy is irrational wouldn't itself count as T philosophy. Look, I don't have any hope of defining it in such a way that the question can't even be reasonably raised. I think the question is going to be reasonably raised, and then I think there's a reasonable discussion. And Tim did a good job of, didn't agree with it, but of explaining what I say in response to that. But I think that the claims, the critical claims that I make are supposed to be the kinds of things that don't engage in the sorts of criticized, are supposed to be obvious or potentially obvious, or you draw attention to certain things and then the conclusion follows. Now, let me try and give my answer. Now, you said it specifically as if, it might be helpful to me if I could, as I do, invoke the a priori, a posteriori distinction. And one thing that's helped to clarify not sure that really helps me, but it certainly is for this previous point, but it's certainly true that one of the distinctive features is supposed to be that. He's not supposed to be criticizing the kind of philosophy that Quine advocates. That's not in the target area, so it's got to be regarded as a priori. And you're absolutely right that very distinction is controversial. And if Quine is right and there is no such thing as a priori, that's, as it were, a kind of separate attack, not the one that I choose to make, because I'm not so convinced that there's no such thing as the a priori, but it's a separate attack that may be a quicker route to destroying it. But I think what's important is that it's not thereby just kind of like a straw man that's being destroyed, because it seems to me that these question marks over the distinction are relatively new, and for a long time the distinction was respected, and I think a lot of philosophers, including the ones that I list who give various theories or in different parts of the subject, do think of it as a priori. So I think it's a worthy target, even if in fact there's a completely separate way of undermining it as an enterprise by criticizing the a priori, a posteriori. Paul, I have to allow to my response. Okay, all right. Well, anyway, that's how I understood it. Okay. Conceptual analysis, you've given yourself 3 questions, Paul. Conceptual analysis. Okay. I don't think that there's any objection to conceptual analysis in itself. Certainly no reason to think that Wittgenstein thinks, or I think, that there are words that, there are some words that have explicit definitions, and you can recognize what the definition of a word is. There's few that have definitions, and that's not going to count as T-philosophy. Or maybe is T-philosophy is where, I don't know, a notion is problematic. Maybe doesn't seem on the face of it to be naturalistic, but you think everything has to be naturalistic. So you find some definition in naturalistic terms and you work like crazy to try and persuade people that this is going to somehow work. So that would be T-philosophy. So it depends what you're doing with the definitions or what the motive comes from, but in itself, I think it's not something which is banned. The example of meaning, yes, and so it's true that on the view I'm defending about meaning, the Wittgensteinian view, meaning happens to be one of those words that is definable. And that's the definition is in terms of use. Now, Plan B, I wasn't completely sure what your objection was to Plan B, so maybe I didn't, that I'm sure of it, but I mean, Plan B is, you see, my own sense is that, I've struggled with this because I've independently worked a lot on trying to develop a use theory of meaning, and gone far beyond the kinds of things that Wittgenstein would say. And some of the things that I say do strike me as clearly empirical. Okay, and so I struggled with, well, what's the part which is a priori and what's the part where empirical evidence is needed, and it certainly does seem to me a line there. And it may be that my own more developed view that the meaning of a word is the fundamental law-like regularity of use that explains its overall use has empirical, needs empirical evidence for it, and something less specific is a priori, but so I do think there's a problem here. But I think in itself the idea of giving an a posteriori empirical reductive analysis of a natural property is not so mysterious sort of thing. One can, of course, debate the particular answer that's suggested, but the idea that one might think that a word's having a certain meaning is a naturalistic property of it, it has certain causal consequences and so on, and you might look for some underlying property of the word that will account for those consequences, seems to me not a reasonable thing to explore.
Run over 5 minutes or so?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, good. Then we keep the questions compact. That's
Thanks.
yes.
I'm wondering if you're really committed to the view of Wittgenstein as therapeutic, right? If that's what it's all about, is it too simplistic to say meaning is use? It needn't be a definition, nor need it be a theory. We could say meaning as use is a therapeutic technique that, given this or that particular philosophical problem exhibited by this or that particular philosopher who's presenting it, it may be useful, it may be not, in order to get that patient to see the kind of way to a dissolution of whatever problem that's
Yeah, I mean, I think that Wittgenstein's therapeutic position and his actual therapies, in the case of particular philosophical problems and confusions, don't in any way depend on the view that meaning is use. What they depend on is the idea that confusions come from people's failing to recognize the use. Whether you identify that with meaning is not really important. They somehow confuse the use, they exaggerate, they overgeneralize. So there are certain errors made that come from, exaggerating analogies between the use of these expressions here, the use of maybe numerals and the use of other nouns. These other nouns, they stand for objects, therefore numerals stand for objects. So objects, surely they're somewhere in space and time. Where are the numbers? All of this kind of thing. This is supposed to be underminable by focusing on the way words are used, amongst other things. But a thesis to the effect that the word meaning somehow can be defined in terms of use or is a matter of its use doesn't play a role, it seems to me, in Wittgenstein's Wittgensteinian therapy.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your critique of consciousness, theory of consciousness. So let's say, even if it's the case that I can't be mistaken that I'm in pain. So, Chalmers, who's one of the chief architects of the theory of consciousness, well, he doesn't think he can be mistaken about pain because he thinks what he means by pain is up to him. Okay? So he's an individualist about meaning. So even if that's true, what's the problem for coming up with a theory of consciousness? I mean, doesn't that just make it more interesting? So here's this interesting phenomenon. Individuals can't be mistaken about the conscious state they're in. So let's try and theorize that.
Yeah, so I don't think the problem is, sorry?
He doesn't think that, does he? Chalmers?
No, I don't think so. But I don't really anyway think that the problem is, that we shouldn't be trying to, there's no theory of consciousness. I mean, I'm sure, there's a lot of work to be done in psychology and neurology and, about explaining pain and other conscious things. the thing that's of interest to Wittgenstein, I think, is the sense that there's something about consciousness that that makes us inclined to think of it as somehow a mystery. You know, not just, oh, there are questions we don't yet know the answers to, or yeah, eventually we'll understand how consciousness arises, we haven't quite got to it yet. It's rather the feeling, well, how could anything possibly explain it? You know, it just seems like something that can't be addressed. So it's not just thought of as, well, yet we don't have the theories and the concepts needed, but with the progress of science, it'll all fall into place in the way that, you know, we eventually explained what life is in terms of DNA or something like that. It's rather the feeling that there's something completely inexplicable. There's somehow an explanatory gap, and just like impossible to see how that could be bridged. You know, so that's the target. And the suggestion is then that really the way of the answer, as it were, to the problems of consciousness isn't some fantastic new theory or some real conceptual breakthrough. It's rather that the whole problem comes out of a confusion in the first place, or this sense of mystery, and that we can in fact resolve it just by coming to understand the mistakes we're making. And it seems to me that one of the things that Wittgenstein, and I'm on board with him here, is one of the things that's identified as a central mistake is this thing that I think Dennett calls something like the private theater, or I call it a private arena model, that somehow you know, you can see your own, you know, it's as if the experiences occur in somebody's private cinema. You can see your own, and therefore you're incorrigible and so on. You can see your own, but in the case of other people, you really have no idea. You've just got to kind of guess from the external symptoms what's going on. And you define, because you can see your own, you define the word pain in terms of what's going on in you, your qualia. And then, of course, it's an unknown thing whether other people have the same kind of qualia that you have, even though they may be using the word in a similar way. So it's the easiest assumption to make. So it's this kind of model which is supposed to be the source of the problem, and that model is encouraged by certain ways we have of using the word pain. Now, you know, to a first approximate, those ways of using the word are easily distorted and exaggerated. And they are the fact that we do treat people as more or less typically as an authority on what's going on in them. And so we think, oh, they've got to really, you know, when you see what somebody else acting in a certain way, it's because you infer from their actions that they're having something which is similar to what you have, you know, when you enact that way. So there is you know, a kind of a usage of the word which, oversimplified, leads into this private arena model, and which leads then to all the other problems. And in fact, the ironic thing is, Tim is, you know, castigating me for you know, oversimplifying, but in fact, the kind of things he thinks, you know, we should be paying attention to are really on Wittgenstein's side. They are showing that the kind of oversimplified view that leads people into the private arena model that then leads to all the epistemological, metaphysical problems of consciousness. That's one of the techniques for trying to dissolve these things, is pointing out that actually our usage is much more complicated than is often, you know, naively assumed.
We'll see if we can squeeze in two more questions just right there. That's you.
Okay. So I'll make a question to Professor Williamson and then Professor Horwich. So first, if you can say more about what you take success or progress to be in philosophy, and related to that, I have a worry about, so you seem worried about someone telling that philosophy is irrational, and you assume that, well, kind of suggested that it would be nice if by the highest standards of pure philosophy, someone would show, via Wittgenstein or something, that it is irrational. And I don't think that's kind of fair, because you might already assume some sort of irrationality when you claim that the only way someone can prove you're irrational if they accept your internal standards of argumentation.
Okay, so about criteria of success. Well, I take it that, like the rest of science and philosophy, we're concerned to gain knowledge of the things we're interested in. And people sometimes say understanding as well, but I regard understanding as fundamentally a kind of knowledge. And of course, there are lots of steps on the way to that, but as where I would have a similar view to what constitutes success as in any other science. About the second thing was, I wasn't saying that in order to perform a critique of tea philosophy, you have to show by its own highest standards that it's irrational. I was just, as it were, I was saying, if you're doing this if somehow you're engaging in tea philosophy, in your critique of tea philosophy, then you're not going to achieve anything very much by doing tea philosophy in a way which doesn't meet the higher standards of tea philosophy. If you're arguing that tea philosophy is bad, I mean the only way such as it were an internal critique is going to succeed is by adhering to the highest standards of tea philosophy. But I wasn't in saying that precluding, as it were, some kind of external critique of tea philosophy that was simply was coming from somewhere else entirely. I mean, I'm not sure how such a critique would go, but I wasn't meaning to rule that out.
We'll just take one more.
Can I say something on that point?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, this is something that came up in Tim's presentation I didn't answer. He says, quite rightly, that I say in my book, look, I don't want to take refuge in obscurity. I think solid arguments can be given, and we should be rigorous and clear and so on. And to that extent, I want to abide by the standards of analytic philosophy. So, and those standards are mainly standards of clarity. And I think that's very important. On the other hand, assumptions, I am making certain assumptions about rationality. I think these are just, assumptions about rationality that everyone can agree with. I'm complaining about some principles of rationality that some tea philosophers, in my opinion, endorse that they shouldn't endorse, that makes it irrational. And specifically, the glaring example, I still continue to disagree with Tim. I think that there's a much too cavalier attitude towards, dismissing data just because it doesn't fit the theory. I think examples the three examples I gave are examples of that. Philosophers who attempted to think that you don't have a good argument, you don't have a justified belief unless there's a good argument behind it. This is a very common feeling in philosophy, and it doesn't matter. You can say, well, what about this case? The reaction will be, well, that just shows that case isn't really a good case of justified belief. It's somehow suspect because you don't have a good argument for it. So I think that's one kind of case. Another kind of case is naturalism. I think, Tim, shares my view that naturalism is false, and there are pretty obvious counterexamples to it. And, there's no explanation for why those counterexamples aren't accepted. There's just ways of trying to cram it into the box. So, arithmetic is the counterexample intuitively. And so the reaction of the tea philosopher is to go through all sorts of contrivances to try and show that, they are naturalistic after all. Maybe we can identify the numbers with physical objects or something like that. So there is contrivance to make it work, which makes the whole thing unsimple and implausible. But there's this feeling that, simplicity, I think, is taken to a degree, is taken so seriously, insisted on to an irrational degree. So, but the norms, it seems to me, I'm appealing to are ordinary norms that everyone can agree to.
But can I say something about those two cases? I mean, the first one is a theory of justification that virtually nobody holds, because virtually anybody who's kind of tempted that way will also have some category of self-evidence or something like that.
What about internalism, to generalize it?
No, but
you don't deny that a lot of philosophs still remain attached to an internalist.
Yes, but they don't. But they won't. They won't say that you've got to produce some kind of discursive argument for everything, because virtually anybody who holds that view is aware of problems of infinite regress and will have some other category that, like self-evidence to fall back on. And in the case of the naturalism example. The kind of natural, I mean, by the way, it's not that I think that any form of naturalism is false. I think that it's just a rather poorly defined notion. But the kind of naturalist philosophers you're talking about, they seem to be more as it were, doing something like the Quinian thing. And so, according to what you were saying earlier, they're not examples of tea philosophy anyway.
I think actually we're in second overtime now. I think we.